Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 203 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Before diving into this week's fascinating episode, some great news to share. Longtime listeners of the show are likely aware of the TIDES supervision model, which my colleague, Nicole Kimberly Staley, and I have created. Big news. We have officially launched our website, thetidesllc.com. That's thetidesllc.com. If you have been listening to the program and curious about our TIDES model, I encourage you to visit thetidesllc.com and check it out. You can find out about Nicole and I. More importantly, however, you can do a deep dive on the TIDES model, learning all sorts of cool things, up to and including, of course, our 4 pillars of change. Those of self-regulation, identity, resilience, and social support. Obviously, TIDES is an amalgamation of everything Nicole and I bring to the table as far as our knowledge and acumen around trauma-informed care and desistance theory. And those 4 pillars really are reflective of both of those disciplines. Check out the website and contact us with any and all questions you may have, up to and including, of course, training opportunities. Nicole and I recently completed an amazing week of training down in North Carolina with their incredible probation officers. So please reach out with questions. And or if you happen to be attending the World Congress on Probation and Parole this coming week in the Netherlands, Nicole and I are both honored to have been selected to give a presentation on our TIDES model to that global audience. So, on the chance that you are also in attendance at the World Congress on Probation and Parole, swing by and check out our presentation, or of course, swing by and have a cup of coffee with Nicole and I. Now, as promised, let's get to this week's fascinating episode. In today's program, we are going to continue our insightful series on profiling infamous serial killers, diving deep into the case of Dennis Rader, famously known as BTK. Joining us once again is the esteemed Dr. Jerrod Brown, Editor-in-Chief of Forensic Scholars Today. Jerrod is also the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, and of course, professor at Concordia University right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, in this riveting discussion, Dr. Brown and I explore the intricate details of Dennis Rader's criminal profile. Not to glorify or sensationalize his actions, but to glean valuable insights for practitioners in the field. By examining Rader's trajectory and the correlates that led to his crime, we aim to empower professionals to recognize similar patterns in different contexts and enhance their strategies for prevention and intervention. Dr. Brown's extensive expertise and dedication to advancing forensic studies make him a valuable voice in understanding the complexities of criminal behavior. Through Forensic Scholars Today, he continues to provide cutting-edge publications and insights to the forensic mental health community, contributing significantly to our collective knowledge and understanding. Stay tuned to this compelling episode as we unravel the layers of Dennis Rader's case and glean essential lessons for forensic and correctional practitioners. Don't miss this opportunity to delve into the intersection of psychology, criminology, and forensic studies with Dr. Jerrod Brown. So please enjoy my conversation with my dear friend Jerrod, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back to the show, Jerrod. Always nice to have you on the Criminologist podcast. We are once again continuing our ongoing series of profiling infamous serial killers. And as I'm sure you're going to also address here, not for the purpose of sensationalizing or glamorizing these individuals or their offenses for that matter, but really to use them as a case study, if you will, to examine their trajectory. Not that we're suggesting that the vast majority of criminal justice practitioners will ever come across somebody of that ilk, but they may come across some of those same precursors, some of those same variables on these individuals' pathways. So we do this to empower practitioners to broaden their lens of some of these same variables that we see on high risk individuals' pathways rather. Today, very pleased to announce that we are going to be profiling Dennis Rader, aka BTK, and I'll let you unpack that acronym of what BTK stands for, but most individuals will likely recognize that moniker of BTK more than his name of Dennis Rader. But let's kick this off with, again, a brief reintroduction for folks who may be tuning in for the first time and or that have not heard any of your great, outstanding episodes in the past. And then I'm going to let you kick off that profile of Dennis Rader, a.k.a. BTK.
You bet. Thank you, Joe, for allowing me to come back. Hope all of you are doing well. So again, my name is Jerrod Brown. I am a professor. I do a lot of trainings for various groups, do quite a bit of consultation too on a variety of clinical and forensic topics, and also go on a lot of podcast programs and write articles and do a lot of work in the area of topics that I think really intersect with clinical mental health, forensic mental health, but I've been doing a lot of work now in the area of more functional medicine, functional nutrition, integrated behavioral health, lifestyle medicine. I'm taking different trainings, different certifications. I'm in another master's degree program right now working on an applied clinical nutrition degree and really trying to weave that science into a lot of the work I do. And I do believe if you're working in the helping professions, the more you can learn about your client's digestive health functioning, which we've talked about that in numerous podcasts, the gut-brain health axis. If you can learn more about inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation, sleep disturbances, poor dietary practices. Joe, we did a segment, I believe, on food insecurity. It only will help you better understand your client on a more holistic level. And if you can look at your client through the lens of all of these other variables, I'm not saying minimize what you're doing now, but just expand it into these topics, hopefully the creation of a more informed intervention, treatment plan, goal plan, supervision plan, probation plan will take into account the various challenges, needs, limitations, and obstacles that so many clients who are involved in the criminal justice system deal with at a neurological level, a biological level, a family level, a social level, and so on. And that's part of the reason why we've done this series together, is to really reverse engineer these really high profile cases to help us better understand what in the world could have contributed to this individual growing up and engaging in these heinous crimes. And again, we're not going to get in the weeds in terms of what Dennis Rader, BTK, bind, torture, kill, is what he called himself in the media, did specifically. But we're going to look at some of the behavioral health aspects, the family factors, but could there be some other biological or neurological factors to take into account as well? So, Joe, any other thoughts on that before we start digging into who he was, his history? And he is still alive today, so he's in prison.
I love how you framed it, Jerrod, and used that term reverse engineer. The NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, has been in the news as of late. But one of the things they do when they go to a transportation disaster, if you will, is they'll reverse engineer that bridge collapse, that plane crash. They examine the black box to try to assist in further accident prevention, if you will, which I'm glad you pointed that out. It's not to sensationalize these horrific offenses, but really arm or equip or empower the practitioner via this reverse engineer process to notice perhaps some of those same precursors or some of those same variables that they can address in some of their lower risk clientele.
Spot on, Joe. Definitely. And what I want to say and just give a precursor is BTK is probably one of the more well-known in recent histories serial killers we've profiled. This case is back in the news just in the last half a year, where I'm not going to get into details and weeds on why that's the case, but you can find plenty of news stories online about that. But interestingly, even though this case is probably pretty well known to the public, there's not a lot that we know about his childhood and virtually nothing about the prenatal world. So again, every time we do this, I always stress we have to start prenatally. That first 1,000 days of life research, very important, day 1 of conception, all the way up to age 2. Now, when we profiled the Night Stalker, we knew a little bit more about his prenatal history. I would recommend going back to that, where we got a lot deeper in the weeds on why it's so important to consider your clients' prenatal health, their prenatal experiences, besides what happened after that child was born. And if you do want to learn more about that, the first 1,000 days of life research, I think, would be very helpful to learn about, and it's very eye-opening. It's very, very important to be aware of. Now, the first 1,000 days of life doesn't relate to like serial killers, but it relates to child developmental outcomes and things of that nature.
I just wanted to add, when you were talking about in your scope of study or in your reverse engineering, if you will, that when you can, at least, that oftentimes looks at examining those prenatal variables. I've even come to realize in the field of corrections, historically, we're getting much better at it. But historically, if you were a probation officer working with a adult caseload, you rarely even looked at that client's experience on juvenile probation, much less those first 1,000 days or even prenatal. So I appreciate your zeal around holistically looking at an individual's entire experience, their entire trajectory, if you will, to try to come up with some answers and some clues to how we can better assist those individuals.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. And yeah, you knocked it out of the park. We're really trying to look for clues here. We'll never know with certainty, let's say, why he did these things. It's near impossible to say, okay, it's because of X, Y, Z. But let's look at all the clues. What could be going on here? So he was born in 1945, still alive today, in prison, lived with his parents growing up. Now, depending on the article you look at, the news story, the book chapter, the documentary, he had a pretty stable childhood, they say. Now, is that accurate? It's tough to know. There is indication that he had problematic fantasy development that started early on in life. We're going to talk about that. And anytime we're talking about a serial killer in terms of what he did to this nature, usually there's really problematic sadistic fantasies that were at play, and a lot of times these sadistic fantasies may have been going on for decades prior to the actual event. And I do want to stress, if you are working with a client right now who has violent, sadistic kinds of sexual fantasies, the overwhelming majority of people who have those kind of fantasies never will grow up and be a serial killer. But most serial killers who do the things he did do have that history of really deviant, violent, concerning kinds of fantasy development that a lot of times started earlier on in life. He was the oldest of 4 boys. He, by all accounts, got along just fine with both sides of his grandparents. Now, there is some indication in this literature that he might have had somewhat of a concerning relationship with his mom, but by no accounts that anything that I can find that's documented, he didn't sustain like physical or sexual abuse growing up. He killed 10 people, maybe more, but he was convicted of 10. His first murder started when he was 28 years of age. His last murder was done when he was 45 years of age. His first murder happened in 1974. He had, if you look at some of the records, he had a number of diagnoses, or it's talked about that it looked like he had these diagnoses. And some of the more common ones talked about in this literature are going to be psychopathy, obsessive compulsive kinds of behaviors. We'll talk about these in a few minutes. Some indication too that when he grew up, he liked spying on female neighbors when he was younger. This particular profile is very interesting. He had no victim preference, so unfortunately his victims were all over the map. Men, women, children. Most of the ways in which he committed these acts were very brutal, sadistic in nature, more hands-on methods, unfortunately. So empathy deficits, clearly, no remorse, lots of entitlement. When he was committing these crimes at various times, he would write to law enforcement, the newspapers, and he actually coined the term BTK. This is an interesting case, too, where we have to be aware of the cooling off process. I'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of times I think if you haven't studied serial killers, a lot of people think that serial killers just keep killing and killing and killing until they're apprehended or killed. There was actually a long cooling off period between some of his murders where he just went dormant for a long period of time. The reasons for that, difficult to say. But this is an interesting case as well, Joe, where he was married, had a couple kids, on the outside looked like a great upstanding citizen, was involved in his church, was involved in different kinds of community activities. Several documentaries have been done on him, and some of the documentaries, they just indicate that he was like the pillar of community on the outside, but on the inside, a dark, sadistic serial killer. So kind of two personalities going on at once. He would stalk his victims. So a lot of things to take into account. Joe, you remember the podcast we did together on criminal profiling, I know, a few months ago? We talked about the art and science of criminal profiling in general. This is a case where, by all accounts, the profilers involved didn't get it right. There was some pushback against the profiling of this particular case because, by all accounts, when these killings were going on, law enforcement were baffled. They ended up having a profile on him, and at that time, before he was apprehended, the profilers, if you compare to what actually happened and looking at his history, the profile was not 100% accurate. So again, profiling is not a 100% accurate kind of science, but we don't want to throw it out. There's still really good things about it. So take that also with a grain of salt when you think about this particular case with profiling. when you talk about profiling, you look at some of the literature that's come out of the FBI and some of the individuals involved in the behavioral science unit, especially in the early 80s, understanding organized versus disorganized offender types. He was an organized offender. He planned his offenses. He targeted his victims. Again, the victim profile, men, women, and children of all ages. So he was a particular type where he was an organized offender. Some of the other podcasts we've done together, Joe, we've talked about disorganized offenders. Joe, I'm going to park the brakes there and just let you share your expert thoughts from your lens.
Thank you, Jerrod. As I often do during these interviews, I take copious notes while you're speaking and trying to capture some of those truth bombs that you're dropping on us. One thing you said earlier, an expression you used in describing his pathways, you used that term problematic fantasy development. I'm a big believer and advocate of cognitive behavioral interventions, up to and including, of course, looking at those risky thought patterns and then engaging in some type of cognitive restructuring to hopefully change those into less risky thinking patterns. But not with this individual per se, but how does that issue of problematic fantasy development, if a practitioner, for example, sees this in a client, could that be addressed via those traditional cognitive behavioral interventions?
Maybe difficult to say, but you would want to obviously consult with like a sex offender treatment provider expert, because if somebody is dealing with deep-seated sadistic fantasies, there's a lot of variables to take into account. For one, and not all this is going to apply to BTK, but if you look at the sexually based homicides and then fantasy development associated with this, a lot of times it talks about lots of childhood trauma. So looking at it through a trauma lens, very important. Some of these individuals may have had head injury cases. And with BTK, there is some indication that he may have sustained a head trauma early on in life. You will find some reports that say that that is accurate. You will find some reports that say it's inconclusive. They just don't know. But you will find some literature that talks about maybe he had a head trauma. So very important too. What is their head trauma? When we talk about this in the context of sexually based homicides, fantasy development years prior to the actual event can oftentimes be a very safe and private place for that person to go because they've sustained such trauma. Now again, not all of this is going to apply to BTK. Over time, those fantasies can grow and grow and grow. And for some of these individuals with these deep, dark, sadistic fantasies, they went inward instead of going outward. They shut out the world. Maybe they dealt with lots of trauma, attachment problems. Maybe there was a lot of bullying and teasing. They didn't have a really good family of origin. So going inward into your dark thoughts is a coping strategy for some of these individuals. Now, am I saying it's a good coping strategy? Absolutely not. But it could be a coping strategy that can help that person manage some unbearable trauma that they experienced. It can be an escape from reality. Dark sadistic fantasies can also be a way to help plan out a crime or select a victim, or it can even stimulate sexual arousal. There's a lot of variables to take into account when we think about dark sadistic kinds of fantasy. So what kind of thoughts is the person having? Are they constantly being exposed to different images, pornography? If so, what kind of pornography? Is it really dark kinds of pornography that they were exposed to early on in life? And again, I'm not saying BTK had these things going on. He definitely had dark sadistic fantasies, but we don't know enough about like the trauma histories, the attachment representations, and things of that nature. Joe, does that kind of answer your question? It throws a lot of wrenches into it. It's not a simple yes or no, because CBT might be partially effective for some. For others, absolutely not. So it really depends on the individual, and you need to make sure you consult with true experts who understand all of these moving parts.
Yeah, you did a great job of addressing that question, Jerrod. And of course, in your response, you talked about trauma. I'm not going to get ahead of your skis here, but yeah, I would love to hear the role that trauma may have played in BTK's trajectory. But again, I'll let you proceed down that pathway.
Well, let's just pretend that we know with certainty he had a brain injury, which we don't, but there is indication that maybe he had an earlier life brain injury. Many of the serial killers you and I have profiled together, Joe, there have been documented histories of brain injury. So brain injury is a type of trauma. So we have to think of trauma beyond the adverse childhood experiences and look at other forms of trauma too. So head injury is a type of trauma. Was there any in utero types of adverse experiences? Don't know. For some of the profiles we've done together, there have been. For some of the individuals we profiled too, they grew up in a home where they were exposed to lots of domestic abuse. We don't know that with BTK. So taking those things into account. If you are working with a client that's had a head trauma history, rule out executive function impairments. Joe and I have talked about that countless times now. Again, that's the boss of the brain, the CEO of the brain. And for some individuals, we're not just talking about one head injury. Maybe for some of the clients you're working with, they've had repeated blows to the head year after year for a variety of reasons. So over time, that can have almost a snowball effect, a cumulative effect. And if you are working with clients right now with profound histories of head trauma, they probably are dealing with some level of frontal lobe impairment. And if your client's frontal lobes are not working properly, what can that do? How does that trickle down into working with a client one-on-one or in a group? More attention problems, more planning deficits, time management issues. So you have clients that have some of these frontal lobe impairments, head traumas. They may forget to come to their appointments. They may be more disruptive in a skills COGS group. You're asking your clients to solve problems and they have these histories. They may have problem-solving deficits, reasoning problems, moral judgment. Clearly BTK had moral judgment issues. You do not do these things without having some level of moral issues, empathy-related problems. For some of your clients too, with head injury histories, more impulse control problems, more issues with abstract thinking and reasoning where they have a hard time connecting the dots, planning for the future. Technically, think about this, Joe. If your client has abstract reasoning deficits and they're in front of the judge and they're talking about an oath or a plea agreement, that's an abstract concept. That client probably has no idea what's being talked about in court, even though maybe the client's giving the head nod or the verbal impression that they get what's going on through the trial process. So in some cases, if these factors are not considered by the courts, it could result in a miscarriage of justice in some instances. How often does that happen? I do not know, but without a doubt, it does happen from time to time. Joe, I'll kick it back to you, my friend.
Thankfully, you've ushered me into the world of neuroscience and neurocriminology, but you make some great points there about just assumptions that the field makes about an individual's ability to comprehend instructions from the court, to comprehend instructions from probation, or going down that line, their problem-solving skills, their ability to connect abstract thought that we just sort of take for granted, as you said, sometimes based on a simple head nod. Well, yeah, they get this. No, they don't. We really need to inform ourselves about what you were just articulating, Jerrod, things like executive functioning capabilities and things like head injury and head trauma. I would love if there's a graduate student out there, or maybe the research has been done, but we really need to shed a light on the abundance and the frequency of individuals who are incarcerated or justice impacted who suffered head injuries. and how that has factored into their experience on supervision or their struggles on supervision. Just like we now look at, well, if somebody is, I don't know, if somebody's illiterate or if somebody suffers from dyslexia, okay, well, we should consider that in our supervision of the client. We're not doing that with head injury. We're not doing that with executive functioning capabilities, which are really at the cornerstone of the efficacy of our cognitive behavioral interventions. The good news is, as a profession, we've realized we need to put cognitive behavioral interventions front and center of our supervision strategies. That's the good news, but we really need to level up and we really need to improve our game as far as how that's landing on the client and what their abilities are to absorb, for lack of a better term, these interventions, and wonder, they don't seem to be getting any traction with these cognitive interventions, or, those cognitive programs really don't have the efficacy that I thought they would. Well, let's do a holistic look at that, up to and including everything you've just been talking about, Jerrod.
Well stated, Joe, and you teed me up nicely, and we did not plan this, everyone, I promise, but you said dyslexia. There's no mention that BTK had dyslexia, but you will find some articles and reports that talked about he had some learning challenges, but then some other reports said he did not, so it gets confusing. But let's just pretend you have a client right now in your caseload who has some learning challenges or even dyslexia. Why should you care about that topic? First and foremost, there are multiple studies that have found that maybe 60% of people in prison have undiagnosed dyslexia. So if you're supervising people coming out of prison and they're on your caseload, if we believe that research, maybe 60% of your clients have undiagnosed dyslexia. And if that's the case, that's an undiagnosed learning disability. People with dyslexia, by no means am I saying that equates to violent behavior or criminality, but I'll talk about some of the variables to consider when that is the case. People with dyslexia oftentimes go undiagnosed. They can have more language problems. They can have difficulty in learning new words, really recognizing sounds in words. It could get in the way of reading or reading comprehension, so just pretend maybe you're an attorney listening to this and your client goes to court, and at the end of the court hearing, there's paperwork, and you're the attorney, and you tell your client, here, read this paperwork and come back next time. Maybe 60% of your clients who have undiagnosed dyslexia possibly grab that piece of paper from you, give the impression, you bet I'm going to read it. And they have no idea how to read it, so they just throw it away right away, and it leads to all kinds of issues. So dyslexia is a real thing. If you are looking at this through a learning disability lens, plenty of research supports the fact that undiagnosed, untreated, unmanaged learning disabilities may increase anger problems in some people. It may amplify stress, isolation, anxiety, loneliness, embarrassment. So learning problems, very, very important. Now, what happens if we introduce criminality into the equation with dyslexia? Dyslexia does not equal criminality. But if you are working with someone who has true dyslexia and they are engaging in criminal behavior, what does that research say, Joe? Poor social skill problems are more likely. More cognitive-based problem-solving deficits, which that should alert you there's probably more executive function impairments. The client likely had earlier language problems. Tons of people in prison have language impairments, according to the research. Growing up, you'd want to look in the case files for problems in school, maybe being held back, more behavioral problems, and a co-occurring diagnosis of ADHD is what's talked about in the dyslexia and criminality literature together.
Jerrod, you noted the fact that we don't know a lot about his childhood vis-a-vis some of the other serial killers you and I have profiled. But that being said, I'm just wondering, along the lines of learning from this case study, were you able to tease out any themes of other serial killers, as far as precursors, rather, things of that nature? And then on the flip side of that, my follow-up question would be, were there any sort of uniquenesses or any anomalies with BTK that sort of sets him apart from some of the other profiles we've done?
Yeah, so similarities, problematic fantasy development early on in life, possible, and I'll say possible maybe, learning challenges early on in life. Cruelty to animals, that was noted. And let's just talk about cruelty to animals in general. Again, if you work with someone who is abusing animals or cruel to animals, and that could involve direct abuse, neglect, torture, abandonment, by no means is that person going to grow up and be a serial killer. Almost nobody who abuses animals grows up and is a serial killer. Even looking at the serial killer literature, there's still multiple serial killers who did not abuse animals in childhood. But if we look at the serial killer literature in conjunction with animal cruelty, what does that literature as a whole say? It talks about more household dysfunction going on. That's part of a reason maybe why the person was cruel to animals. They lacked healthy coping strategies early on in life. That's talked about. That could be a precursor or an indication of early sadistic tendencies if that person is starting to abuse animals. And we've talked about this in some of our other podcasts. Animal cruelty was often associated with more cruel behaviors, sadistic tendencies. It could be a precursor to antisocial personality disorder, conduct disorder, callous and unemotional traits. For some people who abuse animals who are serial killers, lack of empathy, remorse, and guilt clearly played a role. This could be a risk factor for future aggressive tendencies. It could be a factor where that person just felt so powerless in their life because they were going through such extreme traumas and abuse. They took out their anger on the animal. So you will find some mention in the BTK literature that, again, by all accounts, on the outward appearance, his childhood was not traumatic compared to other serial killers. But you will find some mention in this literature too that some people believe there's more to the story than what we know. I don't know the answer. I don't want to speculate. But if we look at the general literature, in terms of animal cruelty, serial killers, possible learning challenges, sadistic fantasies, there's got to be other variables at play that we just don't know, and we might not never know. Clearly, his crimes had a compulsive nature to them, so when studying this topic, it's probably important to understand the topic of compulsion and compulsive behaviors. Those are a few variables to take into account. Joe, as I mentioned before, clearly there was issues with like moral reasoning and moral development. But if we were to do a recap on his life history, there's a lot more that I wish we could go deeper into. I'll give your audience just a recap right now, and then we can try to piece together a few more things. His crimes were extremely gruesome. They involved elements of torture and sexual sadistic behaviors. He targeted men, women, children. He killed at least 10 victims. On the outside, he appeared very normal. Married, children. You asked how he may be a little bit different from some of the other serial killers we may have profiled. That would be one of them. He really appeared very, very normal on the outside. By all accounts, he looked like a very normal, stable individual who loved his family very much. But he had a double life. He was classified as a sadistic sexual serial killer. There is a long cooling off period between some of his homicides. That is a different variable too compared to some of these other serial killers we profiled. He was considered an organized offender. Some of the classifications and profiles that you look at in this literature, Joe, he might be classified as a thrill kind of seeking murderer. He preferred to strangle and torture his victims. So when you have strangulation and torture at play, sadistic behaviors, absolutely. Head trauma as a childhood, I will say maybe. Some accounts say yes, some accounts say they don't know. We have an animal abuse history. His dark fantasies began at a very early life. Some reports say he was a slow learner, had some learning challenges. Others said no. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, Joe, too, he was in the military. Something to take into account. By no means am I saying military history equals problematic behavior. By no means am I saying that. Some accounts, some of the reports on him describe him as one of the most self-absorbed serial killers in American history. Again, we have the empathy deficits. If you want me to go deeper in the weeds with that, Joe, I sure can. He had a very high capacity for decision making. So this is where it gets really tricky and interesting. Remember we talked about executive function impairments from head trauma histories. A lot of times, again, when we have executive function impairments, decision making problems, we don't know his level of executive function. If he had a head trauma, he still was able to execute these well thought out, well planned, gruesome murders. So he had a high capacity for really advanced decision making. Some accounts indicate he absolutely met criteria for psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. Joe, I'll kick it back to you if there's anything that jumped out at you want me to go a little deeper in the weeds on.
Well, you did mention that he was arguably one of the most self-absorbed serial killers on the landscape. Was that not rather, correct me if I'm wrong, part of his downfall was that self-absorbed nature of his manifested itself via him taunting the police, taunting law enforcement, sending them letters, things of that nature. But if I'm not mistaken, that led to them ultimately cracking the case and tracking him down via, I believe it was a church typewriter he was using or something like that to send them the letters.
Spot on. And that brings up a really interesting point. I'm not saying this was 100% going on with him, but I believe at one point during one of those letters or interactions with law enforcement, he directly asked law enforcement, if I send you these letters or whatever literature he was sending them, can you assure me, I'm paraphrasing, can you assure me that this can't be tracked and you can't find me? The law enforcement, of course, said, absolutely, we can't find you, even though they knew they could. So he, in that sense, if I look at that one scenario, what jumps out at me from a neuroscience perspective? To me, it seems like there was some perspective-taking deficits going on. He didn't connect the dots that, of course, the police aren't going to tell him the truth because they're trying to apprehend him. He just went by face value. So if he was let's pretend your client is dealing with perspective-taking deficits. What might that look like if you're sitting one-on-one with a client? They could come off as very bored or distracted or selfish or callous. And oftentimes, if you have a client that is very poor perspective taking, they might have more relationship failures and breakdowns and struggle to work in a team environment. Now, if you apply that back to BTK, it gets more tricky, it gets more cloudy here because he was married. I don't know how good his marriage was at that time, but he was married, he was a father, and he had a job. So maybe he had poor perspective taking in one aspect, but better perspective taking in another scenario. Just something to think about for your audience to be aware of is perspective taking deficits. Absolutely a variable to take into account when working with clinical or forensic populations.
And that's one of those things I've noticed, Jerrod, when I survey the landscape of what we're doing in the field of corrections. I've really been leaning into the value of perspective taking. I think that's an underutilized tool. I've seen other pockets of the world that lean into that a lot more than I think we do here in the States, but I think there's a lot of value added, and it's a simple exercise that the practitioner can go through. And perspective taking is really something we need to encourage with our clientele. Jerrod, you teased it earlier. You noted he's been in the news as of late. I know whenever I watch a biography, I love getting that sort of updated, where are they now kind of thing. So maybe give us the flip side of that tease. What is the update with Dennis Rader that you teased earlier? What's the current status?
Yeah, I think there might be some new evidence that's come to light, maybe connecting him to some other unsolved homicides. I haven't gone deep in the weeds with that, but it has been in the media, I believe, within the last 4 to 6 months, so definitely something to take into account. So I suspect in the months to come, we might be seeing more stories pop up about him in the media. So definitely be on the lookout. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 about BTK if we learn anything new and we try to continue to connect the dots.
Jerrod, before I let you go, I want to tease a future episode we're going to do. We've been talking about the importance of the practitioner becoming a little bit more neuroscience informed, if you will. And I'm going to pair you with a colleague of yours you told me about, Michael Koval. Before we go there, is there anything you want to put a bow on with the case of Dennis Rader? Give us a
lot of other moving parts. I mean, we covered, I think, the big ones. But again, the takeaways, couple things we can learn from this case. Empathy. Learn about empathy development. What are the factors involved in empathy development in general with your clients? Brain-based impairments. Could be temperamental issues. Could there be moral reasoning impairments? Well, maybe in a future episode we'll talk about mirror neurons and how that factors into this equation. Talking about how empathy problems can absolutely impact social competence. Again, a very high percentage of people in prison do have empathy problems. I touched briefly, now this doesn't 100% relate to BTK. Indirectly, there may be some learning challenges, but become dyslexia informed. Again, 60% of your clients maybe have undiagnosed dyslexia or some sort of learning challenge. So that would be very, very helpful. We touched briefly on traumatic brain injuries. We know from the prison literature 50% or more people in prison have head trauma histories. That number goes up when you are working with violent offenders. The number even is higher when we're talking about female offender populations. So half your caseload right now may be involving a client that has a history of head trauma. If that's the case, and if that goes undiagnosed and no one's ever taken that into account, head trauma can relate to all kinds of behavioral challenges in some cases. The client may struggle with processing information in a timely manner. It could get in the way of organized thinking, time management. If your client's court ordered to get a job, traumatic brain injuries, depending on the severity, may get in the way of a client being able to hold certain kinds of jobs without proper support. So brain injuries would be another big variable for us to take into account.
I've been promoting it heavily on the podcast here, but give a shout out to your amazing certificate program on becoming a neurocriminology informed professional.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so I put that together through APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, and really where I'm putting all my energy now, or a big part of it, is in the field of neurocriminology. So basically taking neuroscience, biochemistry, genetics, some nutrition, physiology literature, and infusing it with criminology literature. And the research points to the fact if you can become neurocriminology informed, you're probably going to be in a better position to understand very complex, confusing, deviant behavior. And then if you can do that and understand it, then you can develop an intervention, goal plan, and even prevention strategies to help address, reduce criminality. And another reason why I love neurocriminology literature is it really discusses the importance of, if you want to combat criminality, start in the womb, start in the prenatal world by promoting positive health outcomes, healthy maternal outcomes. These are all things that are talked about in that training program.
I can tell you and the listeners who are familiar with the TIDES supervision model that my colleague Nicole Kimberly Staley and I developed, which is a trauma-informed desistance model, but it is anchored in three theoretical tenets, if you will, that of trauma, being trauma-informed, that of desistance theory, but the third leg of that stool is neuroscience. And I can attribute so much of that to what I learned from you, Jerrod. So we're really excited about that approach that we're taking. Do you want to tease a little bit of our upcoming interview with Michael Koval?
Not yet, but we're hoping, if everything goes as planned, we are going to be talking about the field of forensic neuroscience. So neuroscience meets forensic psychology. What does that mean? How it can be used to enhance client outcomes? How's it used in court? How is it used during sentencing? Forensics, neuroscience is a really fascinating area. And anytime we profile these serial killers, I'm using elements of forensic neuroscience in conjunction with neurocriminology literature. So just getting deeper in the weeds and understanding the brain and how that may, unfortunately, under the right circumstances, contribute to problematic behavior. And part of that is head trauma, could be neurohormones, it could be prenatal malnutrition factors. So those are just some of the variables that hoping to cover.
Stay tuned for that, dear listener. In the meantime, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Thank you once again, Jerrod, for gracing us with your presence and highlighting the light on these high-profile cases, again, for the purpose of educating and informing. We really appreciate the acumen that you bring, Jerrod. Until next time, my friend.
Thank you, Joe, so much, and great work on what you and Nicole are doing with your model.
I appreciate it, friend. Until next time. So if you are interested in the TIDES supervision model, which, as I just noted to Jerrod, is foundationally based on neuroscience, trauma-informed care, and desistance theory, please check out our website, thetidesllc.com. That's thetidesllc.com. I am very excited to announce the scheduled guest for our next episode of the Criminologist podcast. We are going to have a great conversation. I have paired previous guest Alex Walker along with Arshak Gasparan. We are going to be speaking to these two individuals in a panel discussion, if you will, and I encourage you to look for that episode dropping in a couple of weeks. And or if you have not yet heard the individual interviews I did with both Alex and Arshak respectively, go back to the archives and check those out. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and or Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on X. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Big news. We have officially launched our website, thetidesllc.com. That's thetidesllc.com. If you have been listening to the program and curious about our Tides model, I encourage you to visit thetidesllc.com and check it out.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.